Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Selma. I'm a developmental cognitive scientist and will be moderating today's seminar. It is very exciting to host Professor Daniel Casasanto today, a very special guest from the Department of Psychology, Cornell University, who will talk about time, temporal language, and temporal thinking. Daniel is the director of the Experience and Cognition Lab. He studies how the diversity of human experience is reflected in our brains and minds, how people with different physical and social experiences come to think, feel, and act differently in fundamental ways. To study cognitive diversity across cultures, his lab conducts research on 5 continents using methods that range from watching children at play to brain imaging and neurostimulation. He received several awards from well-known institutions such as the National Institutes of Health, American Psychological Association. He's also an opera singer. Please take a look at his lab page and his CV for further information. Now, please help me in welcoming Daniel.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'd like to talk about a story that's emerging about the way we conceptualize time and how our temporal thinking depends on the specifics of our physical and social experiences. Given that time is one of the oldest topics in experimental psychology, it's amazing how much we still don't know. We do know that one strategy people use to understand time is metaphor. Sometimes these are creative metaphors, like that of the painter Salvador Dali here. Writing about this painting, Dali said that to him, time was like camembert cheese melting in the sun. Well, this painting is useful for our discussion today, not only because it's amazing, but also because it shows how metaphors are not necessarily found in language. Using a metaphor means thinking about one thing in terms of something else. And only sometimes do these metaphors in our minds arise in our languages. Now, I, for one, had never thought about time as cheese the way Dali did. For the most part, the metaphors that we use for talking and thinking about time are much more mundane. They're so ordinary, in fact, that we might not recognize them to be metaphors at all. In English, the way we typically talk about time, about temporal sequences extending into the future and the past, is as if there were an imaginary line going through our bodies on the sagittal axis. And on this imaginary line, the future is ahead of us and the past is behind us. Got it? There we go. To talk about succession in time, we use expressions about the past and future, suggesting that the future is ahead of us in space and the past is behind us in space. And so there is a timeline that runs sagittally through our bodies from front to back. And about 50 years ago, Herbert Clark, in a seminal chapter about these patterns in English, suggested that we don't just talk about time using sagittal spatial words, that we really think about time that way. And how does this story go? Well, the idea is that we talk about time this way because we think about it that way, and that we think about it that way because of our bodily experiences of moving through the world with the kinds of bodies that humans have. As humans, the front of our body is very different from the back of our body. And in particular, all of our sensory organs and our feet and hands are oriented toward the front. As we move along spatial paths, we typically do so forward, not backward or sideways like a crab. And as we move forward along spatial paths, the things that we will come to in the future lie literally ahead of us in space, and the things that we've passed in the past lie literally behind us. So moving through space with the kinds of bodies that we have creates a correlation between progress through space and progress through time. This correlation in our experience gets encoded in our minds and enshrined in our languages. Now, I find this a very compelling story, and the question is it on the right track? Surprisingly, to date, there is no clear evidence that the way we walk through space determines the way we talk or the way that we think about sequences in time, about past and future, earlier and later events. And there are some good reasons to question that whether spatial metaphors in language accurately affect how people conceptualize time. These questions captured my attention some years ago when it became clear that the mental timeline could serve as a fruitful testbed for investigating how experience of various kinds shapes our brains and minds. Broadly speaking, we can ask to what extent the way we think about time depends on knowledge that was programmed into our genome. This is very much a live hypothesis. There are developmental psychologists today who are arguing that the spatial mappings of domains like time, a number are indeed innate. And to what extent does our thinking about time vary upon these separable streams of linguistic or cultural or direct bodily experience? So this talk will be a quick tour of some of our work examining how experience in these different bubbles, in these different streams, influence the way we conceptualize time. We start by examining the role of linguistic experience sort of inversely, and move on to a couple of different kinds of cultural experience that we've shown shape the mental timeline. And then the newest findings are about a role for direct bodily experience. So linguistic experience, if we think about time the way that we talk about it, then it must certainly be the case that at least primarily we conceptualize the future as ahead of us on a sagittal mental timeline and the past behind us. Indeed, if we think about time the way we talk about it, we should never be thinking about time using, say, a left-right axis. We never say things like, that was way left in the past. Monday comes to the left of Tuesday, right? Monday comes before Tuesday, not to the left of it. And linguists for years have written about this pattern and suggested that the left-right axis, for various reasons, provides no sensible basis for our thinking about time. It's completely different from the front-back axis of our bodies, which, among other things, is very strongly asymmetric, whereas the left-right axis is more symmetric and therefore more confusable. And yet, starting decades ago, there were a few hints that perhaps we do, or at least can, conceptualize time as flowing along a left-right lateral axis. So in a study by Barbara Tversky and colleagues, excuse me, kids and adults across a few cultures were asked to take a piece of paper, and they were given 3 stickers. The first sticker was plunked straight in the middle of the page, and participants were told, see this sticker, that's lunch. Now you put these other stickers on to show me where breakfast and dinner are. And more often than not, English speakers would put breakfast to the left and dinner to the right of lunch, as if these events are unfolding in time from left to right. So in looking at these data years ago and thinking about all of the linguistics literature about how we really shouldn't be thinking about time on a lateral axis, I wondered whether this was a mapping that we basically created in the lab. Now let's suppose the way you habitually think about time is using a sagittal front-back axis, but you're asked to diagram your temporal thinking on a 2-dimensional piece of paper. Where do you put the stickers? Right? There's no way to actually helpfully diagram time in sagittal space using a 2-dimensional plane and some flat stickers. And I wondered whether if we could measure people's temporal thinking in a way that allowed them to express spatialization of time in 3 dimensions, whether we would see the pattern that we expect on the basis of language. So how might you do that? Well, one way to see how people are spatializing things in their minds in 3 dimensions is to look at their spontaneous hand gestures during speech. Of course, you can make these anywhere you want, and we do. So we recruited a bunch of college students to come into the lab in pairs and read brief stories and then retell these scintillating stories to their partners as if they were their own experiences. What's important about the stories I'll focus on here is that they had a very clear temporal trajectory. The narrative would extend farther and farther into the past or into the future. So here's an example of one of these silly stories that we made up. And watch as this participant speaks and gestures about the history of farming. Watch his hands when he's talking about earlier and later events.
Okay, so I'm writing a report about how farming methods have changed over the course of the 20th century. The farming methods used by modern farmers are a lot different than the farming methods used earlier in the century, which was much more primitive. Like today, they use diesel-powered tractors to plow the fields, whereas only like half a century ago, they were using horse-drawn plows. And then a generation before that, they had to do everything by hand. So I wonder how life is different than the farmers at the beginning of the 20th century compared to modern farmers.
Interesting.
Yes, very, very interesting story. They loved it. So you can see that he's gesturing all the time, right? He's gesturing very systematically about earlier times and later times and in the past and modern times. And you see all of those sagittal front-back gestures, right? The future is ahead and the past is behind. Oh, wait, not a single one. This guy is gesturing very systematically about earlier and later times on the lateral left-right axis. And it's not just that he's making an opposition between different times, right? It's a continuum where farther to the left is farther back into the past. So this is very systematic, but unexpected, given that he's saying things like back, but gesturing left, right? Why this dissociation? Well, one possibility is that this subject is weird, right? I've cherry-picked this out of hundreds of videos like this that we have. What happens if we look at all of the data? Well, if we look at all of the data, wait, we don't need to hear that again. And we look at the proportion of gestures that participants made either leftward or rightward while talking about earlier times or later times, we see a very clear pattern. People are gesturing systematically leftward for earlier times and rightward for later times. Very clear systematic use of the lateral axis. Well, okay, so maybe we do use the lateral axis, but surely we also spontaneously spatialize time on the sagittal front-back axis with the future ahead and the past behind, right? Well, no, not in this data set and not in many others like it that we've collected subsequently. Here, black is when you're talking, when you're gesturing forward, and gray is gesturing backward or towards your body when you're talking about earlier times or later times. And it looks like, first of all, there's no crossover, right? There's no relationship between speech and gesture according to which the future is ahead and the past is behind. Rather, it kind of looks like people just like to gesture forward, no matter whether they're talking about earlier times or later times. When we collected these data, we had no theory to explain that. We thought maybe it was just a matter of convenience. People like to gesture ahead of them. It turns out there's a much more interesting reason, but we don't have the theory for about 20 more slides. This is just a replication of this pattern to let you know that this is really robust. There's very clear evidence for the lateral left-right timeline in spontaneous gesture in English speakers, and no evidence of spontaneous use of a front-back mental timeline as revealed by their hands. So for now, the message that we have is that there's no evidence to support any clear relationship between front-back metaphors in language and the mental timeline that is used most often or most spontaneously by English speakers. On the contrary, we find a very clear lateral left-right mapping. Where does this left-right mapping of time come from? Well, remember the story about walking through space, about how moving forward along spatial paths creates a correlation between progress through space and progress through time that gets enshrined in our memories. We can tell an analogous story, not about walking through physical space on spatial paths, moving through the world, but moving across a page as we read. Across any two pages or within a single page, the way reading works in our culture is that we start on the left of a page at an earlier moment in time and move gradually, ending up on the right of the page at a later time. So with each line of text, we reinforce a correlation between earlier is left, later is right, earlier is left, later is right. So is it possible that the act of reading, right? So the same correlation is found in artifacts like calendars, wall calendars, where Monday is on the left and Friday is on the right for every row. But you don't need an artifact, a cultural artifact that is concerning time, right? Like a timeline or a calendar. Any written text will do. Any written text instantiates this correlation between left is earlier and right is later in the act of reading or writing. Is this experience with the written word sufficient to determine the flow of time in people's minds? Well, we don't want to rely on correlational data. Thinking about the correlations that we find between space and time in language teach us that we better insist on looking for a causal test. So to do that, Roberto Bottini and I a few years ago did an experiment where subjects were brought into the lab to do a reaction time, a button press task of the sort that's now been done many, many times, where you judge time phrases that appear on the screen, like a year earlier or a day later. And your job is to press a button either on the left or the right of the keyboard as fast as possible to indicate whether this phrase refers to a time in the past or the future. And midway through, based on the snark effect, midway through the experiment, you switch the button mapping. So now left is future and right was past, or vice versa. And you compare response times to correctly classify these time phrases as a function of whether you're talking about the past or the future and pressing the left or the right button. And what we see here is in the regular condition, where we're not manipulating anything, participants are faster to judge past word phrases by pressing the left button and future word phrases by pressing the right button, consistent with time events unfolding from left to right with a left to right mental timeline. However, if we expose a group of subjects to mirror reversed writing, we can find out whether changing the correlation between space and time in the act of reading is sufficient to change their mental timelines. So if you happen to read a language like Hebrew or Arabic, or if you happen to be misfortunate enough to come into our laboratory and have to read this mirror reversed writing, we've got the same phrases here, a year earlier, a day later, etc. But now to read these phrases, you have to move your eyes or your attention from right to left instead of left to right, starting at an earlier moment on the right, ending at a later moment on the left. After about 5 minutes of exposure to this mirror reversed writing, we show a complete reversal of this link between space and time. Now participants, these happen to be Dutch speakers, but they might as well be English speakers. We've done it in English as well. Now participants are faster to press the left button for future and the right button for past. So even a few minutes of exposure to an orthography that orients your attention one way or the other is sufficient to determine the direction of the mental timeline. We can also, in the same study, Roberto rotated the text upward or downward, and whereas people came into the lab not spontaneously conceptualizing time on a vertical axis, we could induce them to adopt an upward or downward mental timeline in just a few minutes. We can talk later about the sources of that kind of representational flexibility. But for now, let's just note that we have evidence for the role of cultural artifacts like reading and writing systems in determining how time flows in our minds. So this was something that we expected to find, on the basis of cross-cultural data that had accumulated in English speakers versus Hebrew speakers, etc. We expected to find that orthography could play a role in shaping people's mental timelines. But in pursuing this line of work, we learned something really unexpected about the role of cultural attitudes in shaping the way we think about time. So we were doing an experiment that is a replication of an extension of the gesture experiment I showed you a few moments ago, but doing it in Spain and Morocco. Arabic, of course, is written from right to left. And in our preliminary analyses, we found something that we completely expected to find, which was that the pattern of lateral gestures in the Westerners and the Spaniards, where earlier was left and later was right, was reversed in the Moroccans, that they were gesturing according to the timeline that was suggested by their orthography. Okay, so that's a validation of what we expected to find. Something we didn't expect to find was on the sagittal front-back axis. Now the Spaniards, black is you're putting the past in front of you, gray is putting the past in back of you, consistent with metaphors in language. And the Spaniards were really doing neither. 50% is chance. The Spaniards were not making systematic use of the front-back axis to gesture about time, just as our English participants had not. But the Moroccans seemed to be making systematic use. And our first thought was, well, why are they using the sagittal mental timeline when English and Spaniards are not? But our second thought was, wait a minute, look at these colors. The Moroccans are not only spatializing time on a sagittal axis, they seem to be systematically putting the past in front of them. What's going on here? Now, despite the consistency of this is one completely unexpected data set. And of course, before worrying too much about generating an explanation or a theory to fit these data, first we want to replicate and see if there's anything to be explained. So we went back to Morocco and to Spain with another much easier method. Gesture research is very laborious. A much easier way, more constrained, there are trade-offs, but a much easier way to probe people's temporal thinking is using a diagram task like this. So in this task, participants were shown this cartoon character who was Juan in Spain and Mohammed in Morocco. And they were told that Juan or Mohammed tomorrow will visit a friend who likes animals. But yesterday he visited a friend who likes plants. You have to indicate on this diagram which box best represents things that will happen tomorrow, like visiting the animal friend, and which box best represents things that happened yesterday, like the plant friend. Of course, you counterbalance the animals and the plants and everything else, like the order of questions. The animals and plants are just to throw people off of what we're actually interested in, which is spatializing time. And then we can diagram very simply where people tend to put the past and the future. So this plot shows where do people tend to put the past. And the Spaniards, as expected, when induced to use a sagittal timeline, they activate the mappings that are present in Spanish, as in English and many other languages, and put the past behind them, which means that they put the future ahead of them. Thank goodness, right? This is just confirming what we knew would be the case. The Moroccans, once again, put the past in front of them the great majority of the time and the future behind them. Now, this is now worrisome because we're seeing the same pattern via different methods. What's going on here? Well, one thing that's not going on is that this clearly doesn't have anything to do with their orthography. At least we can't posit any reason why it would have to do with their orthography. Orthography establishes a correlation in space and time on the lateral axis, but it doesn't influence the correlation between space and time that you experience on a sagittal axis. Writing doesn't happen sagittally. We also can't appeal to metaphors in language. Moroccan Arabic has space-time metaphors there that are very much like the ones we have in English. The future is ahead and the past is behind. So it's not about, can we appeal to something about the Moroccans' bodies? Well, so far as we know, Moroccans' bodies are very much like Europeans, and they tend to walk forward along spatial paths, not backward or sideways like a crab. So it's not about how they write. It's not about how they walk. It's not about how they talk. Why are the Moroccans thinking about time backward from the way any theory of space-time mappings on the sagittal axis would suggest? So we started to think, what is different about not Moroccan bodies or languages or writing systems, but about Moroccan culture compared to European culture? Imagine if you were in a culture where the majority of men that you know are all named after the same ancient prophet. Imagine if you and almost everyone you know prostrate yourselves 5 times a day to enact the same ancient rituals. This is a culture that deeply engages with the past, that reveres the past in ways that are different from European and US culture. We started following this thread and first talked to anthropologist friends, and it seemed obvious from anecdote and conversation that this was a very past-oriented culture compared to European and American culture. Here's the idea. Maybe you place the past in front of you in your mental model of time if the past is what you tend to focus on, right? So this sort of sounds like a parody of metaphor theory, but bear with me. We call this the temporal focus hypothesis. Here's the idea. people conceptualize events in time and periods in time as if they were objects in space. Some people tend to focus their attention more on the past or more on the future, some cultures and some individuals. Maybe people place in front of them in their mental model of time whichever pole of the time continuum they tend to focus on, right? And focus on is in quotes because focus on is actually a metaphor, right? Focusing your attention is a metaphor from presumably focusing your eyes. Well, where would you put an object if an event were an object and you wanted to focus your eyes on it, to focus your attention on it? Where would you put it? Obviously, you'd put it in front of your face and not behind your head, right? So here's the simple-minded idea that maybe your habitual focus on either the past or the future determines which direction the future goes in your mental model of time on the front-back axis. How do we find out? Well, first we need to quantify this hypothesized cross-cultural difference, right? And demonstrate that the cultures we're dealing with have different temporal focus, that they pay attention and value different ends of the time continuum. So we made a little questionnaire with items like traditions and old customs are very important to me, or technological advances are good for society, past-oriented or future-oriented statements, and participants were asked to rate how strongly they agree with each of these statements. And as expected, compared to the Spaniards, the Moroccans were strongly past-focused, right? Expressing more agreement with these past-oriented phrases. Compared to the Moroccans, the Spaniards were more future-focused. Okay, so that's the cross-cultural difference that we were positing as the basis for this difference in how people spatialize time. But if this is right, if the temporal focus hypothesis is on the right track, then we should be able to observe this difference in how people think about past and future, and therefore how they spatialize time, not just across cultures, but within a culture, if we could find groups that have systematically different temporal focus. Well, it's actually not that hard. We know from memory and aging research that across the lifespan, our temporal focus changes. Younger people tend to be focused on the future, on that next exam and graduation and getting married and all of these events that will unfold in the future. Whereas once you're past what memory researchers call the reminiscence bump, when lots of these life-changing events have happened, you tend to be more focused on the past. So we gave the Mohammed and Juan task to members of a new subject pool, which were Spaniards, either in university, these are young Spaniards, or older Spaniards who were tested in a nursing home. And what we found was that the young Spaniards, as expected, were very likely to place the future in front of them, consistent with metaphors, but also consistent with their future focus. Older Spaniards, despite being members of the same culture, speaking the same language, etc., were far more likely to put the past in front of them. Not as likely as the Moroccans, but just being old gets you about halfway to Morocco. Once we found this, we wanted immediately to replicate it, because when you find something crazy that contradicts decades of literature on how people conceptualize time, you want to be sure that you're not fooling yourself or others. So again, here is a replication of our temporal focus questionnaire. How much are you focused on the past or the future habitually? This is young Spaniards are future focused, Moroccans are past focused, older Spaniards are right in the middle. And this plot shows correspondingly how people spatialize time. Young Spaniards put the future ahead, Moroccans put the past ahead, older Spaniards are in the middle. Okay, so we've got really clear correlation between the way people allocate their attention to the past or the future and the way they spatialize time in their minds implicitly, both across cultures and within cultures. But we don't want to posit that we found a mechanism that's responsible for how people are spatializing time without doing a true experiment, without a causal test. How can we do a causal test of the temporal focus hypothesis? Well, we need to experimentally manipulate, randomly assign people to think about their past or their future. It turns out that's pretty easy to do. All we have to do is ask people some questions and induce them to write about their past in the laboratory or to write about their future. So people were randomly assigned to either questions like, where'd you travel last year? Or what were you afraid of when you were little? Versus, are you planning to travel anywhere next year? What future event are you afraid of? And after writing about their past or their future for a few minutes, directing their temporal focus toward one pole or the other of time, then they got our silly diagram task. And after future induction, they were all young Spaniards who were randomly assigned toward one induction task or the other. After future induction, these Spaniards were very, very likely to put the past, very, very likely to put the future in front of them. After past induction, they were much more likely to put the past in front of them. So we have evidence that causing somebody to change their temporal focus, to think about to allocate their attention to the past or the future, can change in just a few minutes how they spatialize time on the sagittal front-back axis. So all of these studies were from our initial set of studies done in Southern Spaniards and Moroccans. We and others have carried this task all over the world at this point. It's really exciting. At the time that I was checking in on the progress here, we had 47 data sets from five different continents, many different countries, and the circles and triangles are two different versions of a temporal focus questionnaire. As you can see, and the dotted lines are one is for circles, one is for triangles. The solid line is for the average of all of these. As you can see, it doesn't matter which questionnaire we use to measure people's temporal focus. The dotted lines are very similar to each other. What this plot shows is across these 47 cultures and subcultures tested, this is on the y-axis, this is how likely you are to put the future in front of you. So if you're above the midline, that means that you're likely to put the future in front of you in your mental model of time. If you're below, you're likely to put the past in front of you. On the x-axis, this is your temporal focus as measured by these questionnaires. If you're on the left, you're a past-focused group. If you're on the right, you're a future-focused group. And across these thousands of data points and dozens of samples, we see this astonishing correlation where, irrespective of how people talk about time, everyone in this sample uses future is ahead, past is behind metaphors in their language. But if their temporal focus is either habitually or due to momentary induction on the past, then they're very likely to spatialize the future in back of them and the past in front of them. So, who are all of these dots? I know you can't read this tiny writing. Most of them are countries or cultures where we had reason to believe that we could observe variability in their modal temporal focus, but some of them are people who are transiently in one kind of situation or another. So visitors to a modern art museum versus a museum of antiquity. Chinese people on either New Year's Day or Tomb Sweeping Day, a day when you reflect on your ancestors. Pregnant women. In English, we talk about pregnant as an expecting, right? You're very future focused when you're pregnant, versus non-pregnant control women, right? Anything that manipulates your temporal focus appears to correspondingly manipulate how you spatialize time in your mind. Again, irrespective of how you talk about it. So this is what was once a chance finding and now a body of work suggesting that in addition to cultural artifacts like writing systems and calendars, cultural attitudes about time shape how you spatialize it in your mind. Now let's come back to this idea that we started with, that is the reason we thought initially that the reason we spatialize time in our minds is because of our direct bodily interactions with the environment. And here we have all of this stuff about culture. Is there any role for direct bodily experience in determining how we conceptualize time? Well, we recently discovered a link between motor action and temporal thinking that doesn't have anything to do with locomotion, with moving along spatial paths. And it's a link that we posited on the basis of an idea that we call the core hypothesis. Core stands for correlations in experience principle. So the question here is, what determines the direction of the mental timeline and many other mental metaphors in individuals' minds? And the answer we've been pursuing is the correlations in experience principle. Put simply, abstract domains like time are spatialized in our minds the way they're spatialized in our experience of the world. So the core principle is actually part of a larger theory that Roberto Bottini and I have called hierarchical mental metaphors theory. The big structure of this theory is borrowed from the philosopher Nelson Goodman, who introduced a way of thinking about the hierarchical nature of our knowledge as sets of over hypotheses, intuitive hypotheses about how the world works, and nested within those are specific hypotheses. So here's the idea. We have an over hypothesis. All of us, regardless of our temporal focus and our writing direction, etc., all of us have an over hypothesized mapping or set of mappings that is something like progress through space is progress through time. Where would we get that? Well, either over developmental or evolutionary time, we should encode that this is a very easily observable and important property of our physical world. As objects travel through a series of spatial positions, they also travel through a series of points in time, right? And this is true for any object moving along any trajectory, right? This should be omnidirectional. We should get omnidirectional evidence for this progress through space correlates with progress through time. Maybe stronger on some of these directions than others, right? We see lots of lateral motion, for example. But in principle, we should have lots of evidence for lots of different trajectories through space and time. Then, as we are enculturated, as we are channeled into particular kinds of physical and social experience, some or one among these over-hypothesized mappings between space and time receives a preponderance of evidence. So as members of Western cultures, Western literate nerd culture, where we're reading all the time, reading and writing all the time, we have tons of evidence accumulating for the mapping that farther to the right in space is farther into the future in time, right? We get that through reading. We get that through artifacts like calendars that are about time. We get this through artifacts like rulers that are not about time. We get this through practices that are specifically about other abstract domains like finger counting, right? Finger counting is not about spatializing time on the fingers. It's about spatializing number on the fingers. And yet, as you finger count, you also create a progression through space and time across the fingers. My student Ben Pitt in this paper here showed that actually you can manipulate people's mental timelines by inducing them to finger count one way or the other. So all of these supports for this specific hypothesis that farther to the right is farther in time are based on cultural artifacts and practices. Is there something special about culture? Well, let's see. I'm gonna erase. Wow, I hope you haven't seen. There's been a Zoom message covering up part of my slides for the entire talk, and I'm really sorry if you were seeing that same Zoom message. I just realized that I could turn it off. Now it's gone. So the question is there something special about culture and culture's ability to shape the mental timeline? Well, there shouldn't be. Any kind of experience that provides evidence for one specific mapping between space and time or another should be able to shift the weight of evidence from one mapping to another and cause you to adopt one among these mappings in the over hypothesis. It shouldn't, the power of culture should not, there should be no special role for culture or for language, right? You should be able to see patterns of direct bodily experience shaping mental timelines, so long as these patterns of direct bodily experience encode or allow us to encode correlations between space and time. So my student, Tom Gijsels, noticed one of these patterns. And we started to follow this thread. Imagine that you were about to hammer a nail into the wall. How do you do it? Well, you have to hold the nail with one hand and then hammer it with the other hand. And it really matters which one of these you do first, right? So this person in the picture is right-handed. So can they just start hammering and then place the nail? No, of course not. You have to place the nail at an earlier moment in time and then act upon it at a later moment in time. And this is not just hammering nails. This is pouring coffee into a mug or signing a check. First, you stabilize the check with one hand and then write with the other hand. Picking an apple from a tree. First, you stabilize the branch and then you pull the apple off. In all of these cases, the stabilizing that comes first is done with the non-dominant hand, because it requires less skill and more stability. And the action, which is higher frequency and requires more skill, is done with the dominant hand. So this is a chain of actions for all of these actions that you might think of as unimanual, right? Signing a check, that's just going like this, right? No, it's actually a bimanual action. Pouring coffee, that's going like this. Yeah, try it sometime. See if you just pour without placing and holding a mug first, right? All of these unimanual actions are actually a chain of bimanual actions involving the dominant and non-dominant hands in a particular sequence. What that means is that by performing these everyday actions, we are instantiating a timeline of sorts, right? For right-handers, when we perform an action like signing a check or pouring a cup of coffee or hammering a nail, we are starting on the left and then proceeding at a later time with the right, consistent with the Western left to right mental timeline. However, left-handers doing these same actions are instantiating the opposite chain of actions, right? They are stabilizing first with the right hand, the non-dominant right hand, and then manipulating with the dominant left hand, instantiating a chain of actions in space and time that goes against the Western MTL, right? Because the right hand acts first, acts earlier. So this gives us an opportunity to examine whether we can see effects of both cultural experience and bodily experience. So we knew previously that lefties show, in general, lefties show a right to left mental timeline in the US, much as righties do. And we assume that this is because lefties and righties have the same kind of reading and writing experience in the relevant regards. We use the same calendars, we use the same timelines, etc. And we never had any reason prior to thinking about this chain of bimanual action to posit that lefties and righties should differ in their lateral mental timelines, but they should, because for lefties, for righties, this chain of action is reinforcing the Western MTL, whereas for lefties, it's fighting against it, right? So what happens if we look at performance on this diagram task in lefties and righties? So national US samples were recruited online and told that Bob tomorrow will go to the zoo. Bob yesterday went to the botanical gardens. Your job is to indicate which box, right or left, best represents things that will happen tomorrow versus things that will happen yesterday. Then we collect demographic data, including the participants' handedness. And overall, gray is earlier is left, consistent with a Western mental timeline. Dark gray is earlier is right, contrary to the Western mental timeline. Here's 50%, here would be chance. And overall, righties are up top, lefties are down the bottom. Overall, everybody shows a strong left to right mental timeline, as expected, presumably on the basis of their cultural experience. But here's what's of interest at present. There's also a highly significant difference between the lefties and the righties, consistent with the Western MTL being enhanced by this chain of action in the right-handers, but the Western MTL being contradicted by the chain of actions in the lefties. That was our first sample. Just to make sure that we're not fooling ourselves, we ran this a bunch more. Oops, there we go. And in about 2,500 righties and 200 lefties, we see this pattern clearly, that both culture and body appear to be shaping our lateral mental timelines, such that the Western MTL in righties is stronger than in lefties. So although we still don't have evidence for the sagittal mental timeline being shaped by locomotion the way researchers posited 50 years ago, we do have some evidence for a role of direct bodily experience in shaping how we conceptualize time. Let me wrap up and just summarize what we're learning about the experiential determinants of the mental timeline. It's natural to assume that using a spatial metaphor means using a metaphor in language. Sometimes it can, but actually mental metaphors, whoops, we're freezing on the last slide, there we go. But actually mental metaphors dissociate from linguistic metaphors in multiple systematic ways and on multiple timescales. This means, among other things, that at any moment you might be talking one way, but thinking the opposite way. Among the experiential determinants of how we conceptualize time, we have no evidence for the automatic use of the front-back mental timeline encoded in English and other languages. You can induce people to use it, and when you do, they tend to use it the way that language suggests, but it does not seem to be spontaneously used, and does not seem to be the primary timeline that we use for thinking about earlier and later events. Rather, across 5 continents, people's sagittal mental timelines depend on their temporal focus, which is conditioned by culture-specific attitudes about the past and the future. These MTLs vary independent of their language. And evidence for lateral left-right MTLs, which is absent from language entirely, we see to be conditioned in part by culture-specific artifacts like writing systems, and in part by body-specific patterns of motor action. I haven't given you any explanation of why temporal language and temporal thinking dissociate the way that they do, but I'd be happy to comment on this during the discussion period. But for now, let me say thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk, Daniel. It's very stimulating indeed. I have a few questions, of course, but I will give the priority to the audience. If you have any questions, could you use the raise hand button, and I will unmute you based on the waiting time in the queue. I can see in the chat.
We have one in the chat. Shall I address that?
Oh, yes. Can you see that question?
Yes. Yes. So is this lateral mental timeline, I assume, consistent with de Haen's culturally oriented mental number line? The answer is no. They are both left-right mappings of abstract concepts, but they are dependent on different kinds of experience. So go back to what probably sounds like a very simplistic statement of a theory. Abstract domains are spatialized in our minds the way those domains are spatialized in our experience of the world. What that means is that time should be spatialized in our minds according to the way we experience the spatialization of time in the world. Number should be spatialized according to the way we experience number spatialized in the world. And those are different sets of experiences. And in, let's see, this paper, if you're interested, Pitt and Casasanto 2020 JPG, we show that you can independently manipulate the mental timeline and the mental number line. They really are different and depend on time-specific or number-specific experiences. Let's see, Lola has a question.
Yes.
Shall I address that?
Yeah, do you want me to read, or can you
I can read, thank you.
Okay.
So Lola, thank you. Do you think the spatialization, oops, everything's moving, there we go. Oh, thank you. Do you think the spatialization of time emerges across development and cultural exposure, or has it roots in innate biases or both? I think, excuse me, it certainly changes over the course of development and can even change rapidly, presumably transiently, due to new experiences like we give people in the lab. Whether there is an innate bias is something that I wish we were co-spatialized so we could discuss more. Of course, your work and others has shown that neonates have some kind of spatialization of these abstract domains. Sometimes it's not clear that we're talking about the same aspects of these domains. So, for example, duration, right, is a prothetic aspect of time, whereas succession is a metathetic aspect of time, and they are psychologically different and experientially different, and so we have to ask which aspect of time do we think might be innate. We have, I think, a really interesting question that your lab and our lab are working on from via different approaches, which is what's the initial starting point? This theory posits that there is an initial starting point that is based on humans' experience of the physical world that could very well be encoded in the genome. I have no commitment to the space of hypotheses being learned over developmental time. It certainly could be, but I wouldn't be surprised if it were innate. It's the kind of thing that's good for organisms to know about. However, we have tested in different ways from the way Lola, you and your colleagues have gone after this question of what's the initial state, and we have some evidence that is incompatible with there being an initial left to right mapping of abstract concepts like time. So this again is work by my former student Ben Pitt, came out last year. This is work in the Chimane. They are a culture in Bolivia who do not have writing systems or the kinds of cultural conventions that instill in us timelines and number lines. But if you give them tasks that invite them to express how they would conceptualize the progress of time or number, et cetera, in space, they are very happy to do it. They do it very systematically. What this plot shows is that each circle is a subject. On the x-axis, excuse me, all the way to the left means you show a perfect leftward mental timeline. All the way to the right means you show a perfect rightward mental timeline. And so what you can see here is that people are clustered at the ends, that you're very likely, and that what that means is that you have arranged these in a perfect spatiotemporal sequence. So people are very likely to arrange objects in space. So this is a banana that's goes from younger to older. And people are very likely to arrange these systematically in space, but they don't care from right to left or from left to right, but they don't care about the direction. There is no difference in any of the domains that we tested, time or number or size. There's no preference for left to right or right to left in these adults who lack the kind of enculturation that we have. Now, how do we reconcile this with the data from infants and non-human animals suggesting a very early and evolutionarily conserved left to right bias? I would love to discuss.
We have 3 more questions. First, Katerina, can you see the question? Daniel?
Sure. Let's see.
Yes, thank you for your talk.
Katerina, yeah. Oh, yes. Do your results contradict the pure worth hypothesis? No. In fact, I have a whole branch of my lab's work is expressly Worfian that we didn't talk about today. Language can also, linguistic metaphors can also influence how we conceptualize time. The work that we have is showing that linguistic metaphors for a different aspect of time, as I mentioned, this work was about temporal succession, and so the mental timeline is relevant. We also conceptualize time as sort of an umbrella term for lots of different physical and psychological constructs. Another is duration, and in English we talk about durations as being long or short. We use a unidimensional spatial mapping for duration. It turns out, much to my embarrassment, I learned that that's not true in other cultures. I was giving a talk about length and duration in Greece one summer, and a Greek speaker raised her hand and said, "Look, that's not how we talk about duration, and that's not how I think about it." And I was like, "Well, but all the, but we have 100 years of linguistics and anthropology and psychology saying that that is how you talk about it, and nobody asked Greek people." And it turns out that Greek and lots of languages, like say Spanish, do not prefer to talk about duration as a line. Rather, you use three-dimensional volume as your metaphorical basis for duration. Time is a substance accumulating in a three-dimensional container. Excuse me. And that's not only how they talk about it, it's also how they think about it. And we can train English speakers to think about duration that way just by making them talk like Greek speakers in the laboratory. So I think that I consider all of these aspects of experiential relativity, and that we have different streams of experience, one of which is linguistic experience that gives rise to linguistic relativity effects, but cultural experience gives rise to cultural relativity, and bodily experience gives rise to bodily relativity effects. And it's a complex puzzle to see how and why these things fit together, but I don't see any conflict between all of these different kinds of relativity. Alex, do the different cultural and physical experiences show a change in importance from early childhood to adolescence? That I don't know. We know that there is some developmental work on the emergence of the mental timeline and the mental number line. Some of those papers, I think, focus narrowly on one aspect of the input that children are getting. So there are some claims, for example, that these spatial mappings emerge too early. So again, in contrast to the infant literature, there are papers showing that younger children, I can't remember the age, but preschoolers do not necessarily show any systematic bias for mapping time or number from left to right. I have 4 children, and I have tried my darndest to get all of them to manifest an early mental timeline or mental number line. We have countless board books about counting, right? And every time I say, here's the first and here's the second, and I try to instantiate these left-to-right mappings, and they could care less, right? They just point all over the place until they're 4 or 5 or 6 or something. So my own experience is consistent with the developmental literature that's available that suggests that the mental timeline and the mental number line are not in evidence in very young children. They come into evidence at around kindergarten, and sometimes there are papers saying, well, they can't be due to the experiences that people think, because these kids, for example, aren't very good readers. Well, I believe that, but I have a 3-year-old right now who sits for a lot of time every day, quote, reading. She knows exactly how books work, right? So this is educational researchers have different names for this, something like print readiness or print awareness, right? Long before children can actually read, they are learning the spatio-temporal dynamics of reading. And that's what matters. It's not the content of the words that matters. It's the spatio-temporal dynamics of the act of reading that gives you this correlation from left to right in our culture. So there is developmental work. I don't know. I don't remember the details well enough to say here's when the shift happens. One place to look is work from David Barner's lab at UCSD. Shall I read on?
I think we got one more question, and then
Okay.
I will ask one question myself.
Oh, please. Mariam, thank you. Are there any individual differences in time specialization with personality traits like conscientiousness? Yes, indeed. So the researcher who did this is named Li Heng, Hengli. And indeed, the same person who did the pregnant versus non-pregnant women having their temporal focus manipulated by the experience of pregnancy, looked at temporal focus and spatialization of time in people with different personality traits. I would refer you to Li Heng's papers for exactly which traits, but I think one of them was conscientiousness. As you would expect, right? If you're more future focused because of this personality trait, you should manifest this future head mapping more.
Okay, we got one more question here. It's a bit long. Okay, we can request them to just unmute themselves and ask the question if you like.
Oh, certainly, Viviana.
Viviana.
Sure. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I can read my question if you want. Yep, it was a great talk. First of all, thank you very much for this talk.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you if you think that telling time can have a role in personal MTL. Like, for instance, even within Western cultures, some languages, just said French or Italian, for instance, would say what in English is a quarter to 8. It's read in English and French like 8 minus a quarter. So do you think that it's just a matter of focusing probably on bigger, smaller, or so it's maybe a linguistic thing of putting hours or minutes before, or could it be a cultural thing of probably focusing on what is missing versus what is still needed, like much like the glass half empty, half full?
I love it. I haven't thought about this at all, but it's true that there is cross-linguistic variation in whether you talk about how much of the hour has filled up versus how much is missing. I love it. I think that, first of all, some of these languages require you to do more mental arithmetic than others, at least so it seems to me. French, of course, requires mental arithmetic just to speak numbers. I'm not sure, but I think it's a great question. That's often how these linguistic or cultural relativity discoveries start. You say, hey, here's this difference in the way these groups do this. What consequences should there be for their thinking about X? I love it. I don't have anything offhand, but if you think of how this should influence people's reasoning about time, perhaps along the half empty, half full lines, I'd love to hear about it.
Thank you for your answer.
Shall I ask my question?
Please.
It's not a kind of knowledge-based question. I'm just curious about your opinion about that, because I'm not sure if you ever thought about the impact of the number of synonym words and people's perception about time, because time is a very abstract concept for me. An interesting fact for me is that we have only one word to define the time, which is time. So there are other relevant, very closely adjacent words such as duration, but duration is actually not equal to time because it is defined as the distance taken by time. Neither duration nor distance can be replaced by the word time. This makes me suspicious about the fact that whether time is actually perceptual. When I say this, I mean time is not just a clock for me. Clock is a human invention to capture one aspect of time flow. For example, how can we develop a kind of direct experience about time by using our 5 senses? Someone can say that, for example, we can observe the movement of the sun, and yes, but this is kind of this can only gives us a clue about sense of time flow, but it doesn't help us to understand about the nature of the time actually, or time, space-time, since it is really difficult to conceptualize the nature of space-time or time. Do you think that we need more metaphors or body or analogies to understand about time, or it's really hard to conceptualize this term? What would you think about the number of synonym words, and are ability to think about such abstract concept?
So I think the abstractness of time is exactly why we use space and why we rely on space so much. So as a brief digression, what do we mean by rely on space so much? Well, for example, in this study, where we did this mean thing to Westerners and made them read backwards, right? Which they complained about and found difficult, but they did it. It's interesting to me that they neither persisted in the mental timeline that they normally used, right, which was inconsistent with the progress through space and time that the stimulus induced, but they didn't then say, well, the heck with space. I'm not going to use space to think about time. These experimenters are just confusing me. I'm used to relying on a left to right mental timeline. If they're going to frustrate that mental timeline, then I'm just going to say the heck with space, and I'll just think about time per se, time qua time. Well, if they had done that, we wouldn't have found this pattern, right? We would have just found that after exposure to mirror reversed writing, there was no left-right button effect, right? That they were not spatial, that we would have no evidence that they were spatializing time in their minds. Instead, they rapidly adopted a mental timeline opposite of the one that they normally use. How? Well, presumably it's among the over-hypothesized mappings, right? We have natural experience with flow in space and time in all directions. But I mention this because it's one illustration of how strong our propensity to use space to think about time is, even when it gets in the way, right? So why? Well, I think it's because of exactly what you're suggesting, that time is abstract in so much as there is no organ of time perception, and we can never see or touch or smell time, right? And space is really different in that way. People will sometimes say, well, how is it more abstract than space? Space is very abstract too. Space can be very abstract. But think about all of the perceptual evidence that you have for the spatial versus temporal aspects of a simple event like throwing a ball, right? So for example, when you throw a ball and it lands 20 yards in front of you, you can at any point go back and reinspect that distance, right? If you threw it 5 minutes ago, you could still, and you didn't move and the ball didn't move, you could still go back and observe the spatial distance that it traveled, right? That's a very durable aspect of your perceptible experience, so long as nobody moves anything. But you could only observe the duration for which that ball flew in the moment, and then that information is forever gone, right? You can never go back and reinspect the flight of that ball perceptually, even if you were able to observe its flight and sort of track the passage of time somehow in the moment. So there are lots of ways in which, likewise, if you and your friend each threw a ball, right, and you could compare how far they traveled, right, or how much time they took to travel, that those comparisons are gone instantaneously, but in time, but are very durable in space. So space has lots of properties that privilege it over time for perception across sensory modalities, across some but not all sensory modalities. And I think that if abstractness means unavailability to perception, then time is more abstract in that way, and that you're putting your finger on exactly why we rely on space so much for time.
Well, that's brilliant. Thank you.